They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. For everybody else, 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 for everybody else.
Who, what, when, where, and why. For journalism students, the 5 W's are the cornerstones of writing and reporting. For the rest of us, these questions are foundational to problem solving and critical thinking. Of course, the 5 W's is a bit of a misnomer. There's also an H in there. Of these, when we want to figure out the motivation behind any event, which of these questions is most important? Generally speaking, it's this guy. Why gets to the human and spiritual motivation behind things. And since we're humans, why is kind of important. As important as the other W's are, why remains the foundational, final question that must be asked and answered. Questions answered without the why are unanswered questions. Why is the final hurdle to understanding all things? Because everything has a cause that's born from some kind of a desire or intention, or negligence, which is also a form of intention. Why is the question that is the difference between things happening intentionally or accidentally, and it's why the media and power goes to such great lengths to either ignore it or distort it. And that's because why tells us who's to blame in any given situation.
Why not? Because why?
And this brings us to George Orwell's most important work, 1984. And in this book, there is an underappreciated line that answers the most important question about Big Brother, Ingsoc, and social hierarchies in general. This video will not promote one form of government over another, but it will force us to consider the motivation behind all forms of rulership and social stratification. Because if you read 1984 and didn't come away with the answer as to why governments insist on hierarchy and privilege, while at the same time claiming to promote equality and equity, then you missed the most important takeaway. Because all other facts of 1984, newspeak, doublethink, thought crime, etc., as revolutionary as those ideas were and are, they are not as important as the motivation behind them. They are simply means to an end. Behind every who, what, where, when, and how is why.
Where is Gomorrah?
Yeah, I'll do you one better. Who's Gomorrah?
I'll do you one better. Why is Gomorrah?
Let's get right to the answer of this video's question. Time will not allow for a deep dive on the entirety of the story, so this assumes you are somewhat familiar with 1984, the book or film, and its main ideas. The main character, Winston Smith, works in the government's deliberately fraudulent records department, shamelessly named the Ministry of Truth. Winston is a free thinker, a fact that he has to keep hidden for his own self-preservation. In the second chapter of 1984, Winston comes across a subversive underground book supposedly written by an enigmatic revolutionary figure named Emmanuel Goldstein. His supposed book, called The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, speaks to Winston's ideological sympathies and functions as a critique of the government and as a confessional playbook outlining the goals of the state. Through Winston, Orwell reads Goldstein to us and for us. But Orwell's book within a book doesn't just describe what the evil government does. In a single sentence, in a key paragraph, it answers why it does it. To those who think the answer to the question of why government gives us things like taxes, war, and censorship is as simple as control, you're correct.
Yeah? But why?
Control, as it turns out, as a final answer to the question, is more of a what than a why. And there's a reason behind that reason. And this sentence in this paragraph from 1984's Oligarchical Collectivism gives us the reason. One of them, anyway. And here's the line that gives it away. If I had to identify one of the most important, underappreciated lines of 1984, this would be the one, because this gets to the heart of the problem we face as a species. It's so simple, we miss it. We forget about it. And it's why this video opened with that line from George Carlin.
Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else.
Selfishness is the what behind engineered hierarchies. The sentence on your screen answers why control is sought. But there's more than one motivation at work here. The first motivation behind creating economic class divisions is the most twisted, and it's also the least necessary, functionally speaking. It's ego. People want to feel better about themselves. And since self-improvement through applied effort is hard, the next best thing in a competitive world is to restrict the progress of your opponents, the masses. This is achieved through public and private policies that rig the game in favor of the quote-unquote privileged. These are the folks in the Hunger Games, living high off the hog in the capital, while the masses in the districts scrape by on considerably less. But that's another book and film for another day. Here's an important scene from the 1984 version of 1984 that illustrates what real privilege is. This is not white privilege, but class privilege. Racial/gender privilege is the exaggerated, outmoded distraction that's given to the masses through our media and its mockingbirds to direct attention away from what real privilege is and means.
You can... Yes. You're allowed that privilege. What's the moral of this? It is called wine.
This scene points back nicely to the sentence highlighted earlier. Outside of engineered scarcity, there's no reason why someone like Winston is never allowed to enjoy a satisfying glass of wine. There's also no good reason why elite party members should enjoy an exclusive relief from the background noise of government propaganda. These kind of perks are reserved for the folks a bit higher on the ladder. The good things are reserved for them, and the bad things for everyone else. In totalitarian socialism, equality in practice means an equalized amount of material poverty for those living at the bottom of the pyramid. At the same time, privileges are secured for the ruling class who enjoy exclusive access to the things reserved for itself. This is privilege for its own sake. Sharing and austerity, it seems, are always wonderful principles for other people to live under.
The real people went away.
When I was growing up, 1984 was the book that the American academic left wing just loved. It was assigned reading in a lot of high schools. 1984 was an indictment of institutional power, and since liberals seemed to wield a little less cultural and economic influence, they identified with the victims in Orwell's book. Strangely enough, a chunk of at least 2 generations of left-wing sympathizers simultaneously identified with the class struggles of Oceania's residents, while at the same time failing to recognize or appreciate that Oceania actually represented a pathological version of their own political ideas, in theory, if not in practice. Ironically, this itself is a powerful real-world example of Orwellian doublethink, or more precisely, the embrace of cognitive dissonance. To square these ideas, left-leaning readers of 1984 must pretend that the government in it is not really socialist, but fascist. Conversely, right-leaning readers use the book to justify the pathological tendencies of free market capitalists. But the point is moot. Concentrated power in either system tends toward corruption, because the source of the problem is spiritual.
There is no political solution. We are spirits in the material world.
Orwell's book doesn't hide the fact that it is attacking primarily left-wing idealism, at least as understood by the author. The name of the government in 1984 is Ingsoc, and Ingsoc is an abbreviated phonetic combination of the words English and socialism. This is Orwell flat out telling readers that the hellscape in 1984 is not a free market capitalist one, but a socialist communist one, with the best of intentions, of course. This need to feel better about ourselves, relative to others, is not limited to those at the top, and people on the lower rungs of the social ladder would be wise to not think too highly of themselves, or imagine they'd fare much better in the face of power and all the advantages and privilege it confers. We'll revisit this point at the end. We all have a duty to survive, not just for ourselves, but to those we provide for. But of course, self-preservation in the modern industrialized world doesn't mean preserving our biological life. It means preserving our lifestyle. And while those things are radically different, because many people are sufficiently lazy and spiritually poor, they identify their style and standard of living with life itself. Those who don't know or appreciate the spiritual nature of things, including themselves, are left exclusively with the material things that define them in relation to others. And to anyone that enjoys their stuff, particularly if they have a lot of stuff, the prospect of having to part with those things might seem like a sort of death itself. It certainly would be an ego death. Again, this is not to pick on anyone in particular. This is simply a tendency of our current westernized human condition, and you certainly don't have to be a 1%er to be materially focused or obsessed. This sentence, also in 1984's Book Within a Book, explores the threat that was once expressed in the 1960s as power to the people. Orwell, via the fictional Goldstein, writes, "For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance." Another George said it this way.
They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting by a system that threw them overboard 30 years ago.
By the way, this is also why there's a lot of anger and focus from the right-wing side of the aisle over immigration and the poor. The point isn't that immigrants and migrant workers don't add increased strain to the job market and resources. They do. And it's not racist to notice it. But noticing it without acknowledging that migrants are responding to the same self-interest we all have, and more importantly, are responding to the moneyed class demands for cheap labor, is kind of like blaming prostitution on the John and not the hoe. And certainly never the pimp.
Me love you long time.
Desperately poor people are the custodians and the customers of business interests. It takes two to do the free market toxic tango. But the message from traditional right-wing media sources has been that the poor are dancing without a partner. Having secure borders is fair and reasonable, and the left wing is tremendously disingenuous and overstates its claim when they reduce calls for immigration reform as exclusively racially motivated. But while cracking down on illegal immigration might solve some problems, it won't solve the problem. And the problem in question is self-interest in relation to resource management, which brings us to our final point for today. Management of resources is an advantageous rationale for the elite to have. It allows them to justify to themselves and to others calls for austerity or limits on consumption, not for themselves, of course, but for society. A society with limits that they are happy to exempt themselves from.
Here. What's this? It's for when you're full.
It makes you sick. So you can go on eating.
How else could you taste everything?
You shouldn't own a gas-powered car, but they really need their private jets. They're members of the inner party and are too important to be hampered by socialistic limits or environmental impact, don't you know? The reason resource management and environmentalism are such effective arguments for propagation and self-delusion is that it might be true. It provides plausible deniability by those in the position to deny others the same things they dare not part with themselves. At once, it allows claims to be made that justify hierarchical differences and without the burden of having to provide tangible evidence in support of itself. After all, can you prove that we're not running out of oil and ought to restrict its usage? Do you know what's the available metric tonnage of lithium in the earth right now? The government and its industry cronies, through the media, always has 100 ways of claiming that there's not enough of a particular resource to go around. And people who depend on such resources for their way of life have nothing to stand on by way of counter-argument or evidence. The public is simply forced to accept the claims that the pseudo-public managers and private owners of those resources provide. Claims which may or may not be true, and are probably at least a little full of shit.
The ice age is coming, the sun's zooming in. Meltdown expected, the wheat is going thin.
Anything that would move the needle toward any consequence that would upset the interests of power will never be on the ballot. Because power owns and controls the beginning, middle, and end of the electoral process. Keep voting if you like, but understand that if it affects anything, it won't be anything that wasn't already approved by the system itself. Because the actual managers of government, despite what people think, are not dumb. They are quite smart concerning their goals. And when things don't seem to be working, understand that they are still, most likely, working exactly as intended. What might seem like a failure to a normal person might be a rousing success to a psychopath. The evidence of this claim are the results we are seeing at work in our country and beyond.
But why do you need to wreck this company? Because it's wreckable, all right?
So there it is. The somewhat simple why behind the motives and machinations of institutions and individuals on this planet. In summary, and in short, we live at the mercy of the rate of production and distribution of resources, and we do so within the limited space called Earth. So no matter who sits on the throne or thrones, the game remains the same. The control and management of the resources and people in that limited space, with winners and losers, and a whole lot of fighting or cooperating as we jockey for position and privilege. You and I, and everyone we know are all in this game too. Generally, it's not as serious as a sinking ship, but it can be. So before closing, let's turn these moral questions once more back on ourselves where they belong, instead of pointing them at New York, Washington, London, or Oceania, because given the current crop of global leadership, we can continue to expect exactly nothing. But the good news is that we still get to decide, to a certain degree, how we engage, even when our choices suck, and they often do. They remain our choices, and there's no point to complaining about a crummy hand if you're in no position to do anything about it. While the conditions on the ground will make our range of choices satisfactory or sucky, the fundamental questions remain. What will you do? How will you play? And why? Because whether you are a high-level player or low-level pawn, you remain directly responsible for the choices you make within the limited range of your influence and power. So before we seek fault in others, don't assume that things like elections and term limits will give us the benevolent dictator we're hoping for. Being honest, do you believe that most people right now are capable of consistently rising to the occasion to do the right thing if it meant denying themselves personal advantage. In the face of great privilege and power, do most people do the right thing at the expense of their own short-term gain? Would you? Would I? I'd like to think so. And we do have plenty of examples of selfishness and sacrifice. But unless you've really been tested, it's hard to know for sure. And with that, I'll hand the outro to someone else. Thanks for listening.